It was the kind of humid Georgia night that clings to you, sinking into your bones like thick fog. I was back on American soil, yet the job that brought me here was anything but typical. I was used to strange assignments. After serving my time in the military and taking private contracts, I'd seen a fair share of oddities. But the official briefing they'd handed me, stamped with government seals and words like confidential and priority clearance, hinted that this mission would be different. When the government approached me, the man who'd handed me the folder introduced himself with a simple "Carter." His hand was cool and dry, his expression cold, all business. He was dressed in a standard black suit, no name tag or insignia, just an impenetrable stare and a file he wouldn't let go of until I reached for it. He held my gaze, sizing me up like he was gauging my reaction to this outlandish request. I couldn't help but chuckle when he mentioned cryptids, monsters, creatures that lurk in shadows. It sounded ridiculous, the stuff of urban legends. But when I flipped open that folder, the laughter died in my throat. Pages upon pages of detailed reports, eerie photos, eyewitness accounts. Far too many to dismiss as folklore. The eyewitness reports were eerily consistent, yet diverse. Sightings of something massive, animalistic, yet somehow off, lurking in the shadows of the Okefenokee Swamp. The swamp itself was a monster, stretching across Georgia and Florida, sprawling with ancient cypress trees and thick, hanging moss. But the creature in the photos, half caught in the dark as though it resisted the very light itself, sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Do you really think something like this exists?" I asked, barely able to keep the incredulity out of my voice. The man's jaw clenched as he looked me square in the eye. "Something exists out there, Mr. Carter, and it's more than just a tall tale." His tone was flat, like he'd rehearsed this conversation countless times, as though he'd been forced to tell himself over and over that what he'd seen was real. "Your task is simple. Find it, confirm it, and if necessary, contain it." Contain it. Government lingo for neutralize, terminate. I'd been given similar directives before, but I'd never been sent in to hunt something no one could even identify. I was still reeling from the meeting, my mind buzzing with images of the creature, the trees scarred with claw marks, and strange patterns carved in the swamp's mud. That night, in a cheap, damp motel off Highway 82, I tossed and turned. The AC groaned in the background, rattling with every gust, while my mind replayed the photos and reports. Images of the creature, always half hidden in shadows, its eyes seeming to glimmer with an unsettling intelligence, filled my thoughts. I could feel the weight of those eyes, staring back at me from behind the thin walls of the motel, pressing down on me like a presence. The uneasy thoughts kept circling back. Why send a team with combat experience after a creature? If they thought it was just an animal, they would have sent in animal control or researchers. This was different, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this mission than they were telling us. As dawn crept over the horizon, I prepared to meet the others. The team had been assembled with unsettling precision. At first light, we met in the motel's makeshift conference room, an old storage closet repurposed into something half-functional. I took a seat at the narrow folding table, noticing every detail. The maps spread out, the grainy black and white surveillance photos taped up on the walls. It felt like something straight out of a thriller, and the tension was thick in the air. The other two were waiting, sizing me up as I walked in. First was Jacobs, a lean, no-nonsense operator with the steely look of someone who'd seen his fair share of darkness. He had a scar running from the corner of his eye down to his jaw, just visible enough to catch in the motel's dim light, and a constant alert tension like he was ready to pounce at the slightest hint of danger. He nodded at me, just a brief acknowledgement, and continued scanning the maps with a laser focus that I could only hope was infectious. Then there was Dr. Meredith Langston, the team's scientist. She was a surprise. Thin and tall, with an almost ethereal air about her, she had a delicate frame that seemed out of place in a room built for brawny military types. But her eyes told a different story. There was an intense intelligence there, something sharp and unyielding, and she regarded me with the same skepticism that I'm sure she got from most of us. She didn't look up from her notes when she introduced herself. "Meredith, I'm here to make sense of whatever we find." Jacobs grunted. his attention flicking between us before speaking in his gravelly voice. "She's the brain, I'm the brawn, and you're the new guy." He nodded at me, though his words carried a hint of amusement. "Let's make sure this thing doesn't chew us up and spit us out before we even get to see it." Despite myself, I chuckled. It was strange to laugh given the situation, but Jacobs's dry humor felt grounding. It took some of the edge off the surreal nature of our mission. Meredith adjusted her glasses and pointed to a part of the map marked with a large X. "This is where the most recent sightings have been. According to eyewitnesses, it's close to where 2 campers went missing. Their bodies haven't been found, but the search teams discovered evidence: blood, torn clothing, and these." She held up a photo of large, ominous tracks that seemed to defy categorization. The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen, clawed, wide and deep, pressing into the muddy earth as though whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Too heavy for any known predator in these parts. "Any guesses on what could make those tracks?" I asked, not expecting an answer but needing to break the silence that followed. Meredith's brow furrowed as she shook her head. "If I had to guess, I'd say something between a bear and a wolf, but that doesn't explain the size." She traced a finger along the edges of the print in the photograph, her voice soft but resolute. "Whatever it is, it's evolved to survive out here, and judging by the depth of these prints, it's something powerful." Jacobs grunted his approval. "Let's hope we're faster than it is." We spent hours poring over the maps, analyzing terrain and possible routes, marking areas where we'd establish camp and positions where we'd set up tracking equipment. The deeper we got into the plans, the more palpable the tension grew. We all felt it, the strangeness of the situation, the foreboding sense that we were walking into something none of us understood. As we prepared to head out, Carter pulled me aside. He didn't say anything for a moment, just studied me with a measured look, as though he was calculating whether I had what it took to handle what lay ahead. "This mission isn't like the others, Carter," he said finally, his tone low and ominous. "You may think you're ready, but nothing can prepare you for what's out there." His words lingered in my mind as we set out, loaded with gear, weapons, and every precaution the government had provided. Still, none of us knew if it would be enough. The deeper we ventured into the swamp, the further we'd leave behind the comforts of the known world, entering a place where nature reigned supreme, a place where human rules no longer applied. The drive to the swamp was tense, to say the least. We packed our gear into a rugged military Humvee, outfitted for off-road conditions, loaded with enough supplies to sustain us for days if things went south. Carter drove, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the narrow, winding road ahead. Beside him, Meredith reviewed notes, flipping through photos, her lips pursed as she absorbed every detail. She'd barely said a word since we left the motel, which only served to heighten the thick, expectant silence. As the sun rose higher, the landscape began to change. The trees thickened, their branches intertwining above us to create a tunnel of dappled green light. Spanish moss hung in wisps from the branches, casting strange shadows on the windshield. It was beautiful in a haunting way, as though the swamp had a soul of its own, ancient and wise, watching us as we dared to venture deeper into its territory. We pulled up to a clearing at the edge of the Okefenokee swamp, and the air seemed to change immediately. The usual chirping of birds and hum of insects was almost non-existent, replaced by an eerie silence that was more oppressive than comforting. I felt like I was stepping into a new world, one that had little regard for human presence. "All right, this is as far as the vehicle goes," Jacobs announced as he checked his rifle. "From here on, we're on foot." We shouldered our packs and set off into the dense undergrowth, the ground beneath our boots wet and spongy. Every step made a soft squelching sound, adding to the feeling that we were disturbing something that preferred to be left alone. "Stay close," Carter said, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might alert the swamp to our intrusion. "We're heading to the first coordinates, about a 2-mile hike from here." The path was barely a path at all, more a winding snake of trampled brush that faded as we moved deeper into the swamp. Tall reeds rose on either side, and the scent of stagnant water filled the air, thick and cloying. Sweat clung to my skin, mixing with the mud that soon caked our boots and pants. And yet, as uncomfortable as it was, I could feel the anticipation building inside me, an odd exhilaration at the thought of what lay ahead. As we moved, Jacobs broke the silence. They say this place is cursed. People vanish out here all the time, swallowed by the water, lost in the fog. Sometimes bodies are found. Sometimes they aren't. Not exactly the pep talk I was hoping for, I muttered, but his words lingered in my mind. Meredith glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the trees with something that looked like both fascination and fear. It's not superstition. This ecosystem is unlike any other in the U.S. The biodiversity here is off the charts. There are species that thrive here and nowhere else. The swamp seemed to tighten around us as she spoke, as though it was listening. The deeper we went, the more it felt like the swamp was alive, sentient even, with a pulse that thrummed beneath the mud and water. It felt old, older than anything I'd ever encountered, and ancient enough to hold secrets that no man could fully understand. As we continued, we began to see signs, the evidence we'd been looking for, yet hoping not to find. The first sign was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Just off the trail, Jacob spotted a strange, twisted tree. Its bark was stripped in long, jagged lines, claw marks embedded deep, as though something powerful had taken a swipe at it. "Look at the depth of these," Meredith murmured, kneeling beside the tree to inspect the marks. She brushed her fingers over the scars with a distant, almost reverent expression, like she was trying to imagine the creature that made them. "These aren't from a bear or a wildcat. The claws are spaced too far apart. Whatever did this was large and strong." I glanced around, feeling a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. We were being watched. I could feel it, a creeping awareness that settled heavily between my shoulder blades. The swamp was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that warned of something lurking just out of sight. We pushed forward, our pace slowing as the ground grew softer and more treacherous. Strange, half-decayed tree roots jutted out of the mud like skeletal fingers, and the stench of rotting vegetation clung to everything. I tried not to breathe too deeply, but the air was thick and stifling, as though it were pressing down on us with unseen hands. Then we found the tracks. They were massive, pressed deep into the mud, clawed and wide, unlike any animal track I'd seen before. I crouched to get a closer look, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. The tracks had a strange, almost human-like shape, but they were much too large, and the claw marks at the tips were something out of a nightmare. "Whatever made these is big," Jacobs muttered, squatting beside me to examine the tracks. He traced a finger along the edge, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Too big to be anything local, and by the looks of it, it's bipedal." Meredith looked uneasy, glancing from the tracks to the dense forest around us, her eyes shadowed with a worry she couldn't hide. It could be something entirely undocumented, or something ancient, something that's managed to stay hidden here. The Okefenokee has been untouched in places for centuries. It's not impossible that some prehistoric species could have adapted and survived here. Jacob snorted. Or it's something that doesn't belong here at all. We moved cautiously, more aware than ever that we were on borrowed time. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the swamp itself was warning us, urging us to turn back. I could feel a chill seeping into my bones, despite the thick humidity. There was something wrong here, a wrongness that permeated everything, wrapping around us like the roots of the trees. Hours passed, the light dimming as clouds gathered overhead, casting the swamp in a perpetual twilight. Our path twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the heart of the Okefenokee until we came upon a small clearing. In the center stood another tree, larger and older than the others, its trunk marred by the same deep claw marks we'd seen before. This time, however, there was something else. A strange, almost ritualistic arrangement of sticks and bones at its base. "What is that?" I whispered, feeling an inexplicable dread as I looked at the formation. The sticks were arranged in a crude circular pattern, and in the center lay a scattering of small animal bones, bleached white and brittle. Meredith examined the formation, her face pale. It's almost like a warning. Jacob's eyes narrowed. A warning from what? Or for what? A sound broke through the silence then, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. It was deep, resonant, almost like thunder, but more menacing, laced with a primal fury that raised the hair on the back of my neck. We all froze, instinctively huddling closer together, our eyes darting through the trees, searching for the source of the sound. The growl faded, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Jacobs tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white. "That's not a bear," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Meredith's face was drained of color, her eyes wide with fear. "Whatever it is, it's close." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone out here. Whatever had left those tracks, made those claw marks, and arranged those bones, it was out here, somewhere in the dense, shadowed forest, watching us. And it wasn't happy. We continued on, our pace slower now, every sound magnified by the silence that surrounded us. The swamp seemed to close in tighter with each step, the shadows growing darker, the air thicker, until it felt like we were moving through a dream, a dark, feverish vision from which we couldn't wake. The creature's presence was everywhere, in the claw marks on the trees, in the scattered bones we found half buried in the mud, in the strange, almost ritualistic arrangements of sticks and stones that seemed to mark its territory. Each new discovery added to the growing sense of dread, the realization that we were intruding on something ancient and powerful, something that didn't want us here. We were walking a razor's edge, each step taking us closer to the heart of the creature's domain. And with each step, I could feel it drawing nearer, the invisible predator that stalked us through the shadows, unseen but ever present, a dark, relentless force that watched and waited, biding its time. As the light began to fade, Jacobs called for a halt, his face grim as he surveyed our surroundings. "We'll set up camp here for the night," he said, his voice low and steady. "Keep your weapons close. We're not alone out here." We worked quickly, setting up our gear, clearing a small area of the undergrowth to create a rough circle. The swamp seemed to press in around us, the darkness thickening as night fell, swallowing the last remnants of daylight. We built a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees, illuminating the twisted branches that loomed overhead like skeletal fingers. Meredith sat across from me, her face drawn and pale, her eyes fixed on the fire, as though she could see something in the flames that the rest of us couldn't. Jacobs was silent, his expression unreadable as he cleaned his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. None of us spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own fears. After a while, Meredith broke the silence. "Do you think it knows we're here?" Jacobs looked up, his eyes hard, his face shadowed in the firelight. "It knows," he said, his voice flat. "It's known since the moment we stepped foot in its territory." I glanced at him, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You really think it's intelligent?" Jacob shrugged, his gaze shifting to the darkness beyond the firelight. "I think it's something we don't understand, and that makes it dangerous." The fire crackled, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees, the only light in a world of darkness. I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that we were sitting on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from a fall we might not survive. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the sounds around us, listening for anything that might indicate the creature's presence. But the swamp was silent, an eerie, unnatural stillness that seemed to press in around us, amplifying every rustle of leaves, every whisper of the wind. As the night wore on, I found myself drifting into a restless sleep, my mind filled with images of the creature, of dark eyes watching us from the shadows, of clawed hands reaching out from the darkness. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my body tense with a sense of imminent danger. The fire had died down to a low smolder, casting only the faintest glow, and the darkness around us seemed deeper, more oppressive than before. Jacobs was already awake, his eyes scanning the darkness, his rifle at the ready. Meredith was asleep, her face pale and drawn, a slight frown creasing her brow as she shifted restlessly. I sat up, my hand automatically going to my rifle, my senses on high alert. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight, and I had the distinct feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any movement. But the swamp was deathly silent, as though holding its breath, waiting. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, so deep and resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the ground, shaking the very air around us. It was a sound that was both primal and intelligent, a warning and a threat, and it sent a shiver of fear down my spine. Jacob stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness, his rifle raised and ready. I could see the tension in his body, the barely restrained fear in his eyes, and I felt my own pulse quicken, a surge of adrenaline flooding my system as I prepared for whatever was out there. The growl faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, and for a moment, no one moved, each of us frozen, waiting. Then just on the edge of the firelight I saw it, a shadow, large and hulking, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness, watching us with a fierce, predatory gaze. The creature moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its massive form blending into the shadows, its eyes fixed on us with an intelligence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. I felt a surge of fear and awe as I watched it, unable to look away, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen, a twisted blend of animal and something other, something that defied all logic and reason. It was watching us, studying us, and I had the distinct impression that it was assessing us, deciding whether we were worth the effort. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness as though it had never been there. For a long moment, no one spoke, each of us processing what we had just seen, the reality of it sinking in like a stone. Jacobs was the first to break the silence, his voice low and steady. That was a warning. Meredith's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, her hands trembling as she clutched her notes, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what we had just witnessed. "We're not alone out here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And whatever that is, it's not just an animal." The words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the reality we now faced. We were no longer just on a mission. We were part of something far greater, something ancient and powerful, something that didn't want us here. And as we sat in the darkness, surrounded by the silence of the swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, a boundary we were never meant to cross. And there was no going back. The swamp was more than silent now. It felt oppressive, the thick humidity pressing down on us as we sat around the dying fire. The recent encounter had left us shaken, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The memory of the creature's eyes, intelligent, cold, assessing, burned into our minds. We were no longer just hunters or explorers. We were trespassers, and the swamp made that clear with every silent, watchful second that stretched into hours. Meredith hadn't said much since the creature disappeared back into the shadows. She sat close to the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the embers as though they held answers. Her face was drawn and pale, her brows knitted in thought, the orange glow casting shifting shadows across her face. I couldn't help but study her, watching the way her mouth pulled into a frown, her eyes shadowed and deep with something that was almost sadness. I moved over, taking a spot beside her, keeping a slight distance as I settled into the damp earth. The air between us felt charged, a tension that had been growing since we started this journey, but had somehow intensified with the night's events. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, keeping my voice low so as not to disturb the tense quiet around us. She glanced at me, a faint smile tugging at her lips before she shook her head. "Not at all," she murmured, her voice soft and weary. I could use the company. We sat in silence for a moment, each of us lost in thought, listening to the quiet crackle of the dying fire. After a moment, Meredith sighed, her shoulders sagging as though under a great weight. "This wasn't what I expected," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I thought this would be just another assignment, another study of unknown species, something I could understand." She paused, her gaze fixed on the embers. "But this feels different. Dangerous." I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "It's not just an animal, is it?" She shook her head, her gaze distant. "No, it's something more. Something primal. As if it's always been here, watching and waiting." She looked at me, her expression vulnerable. "It's strange, but I feel connected to it somehow. Like it's tied to this place in a way we can't understand." I felt a flicker of something deep within me, an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her words resonated with me, a strange sense of understanding that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. We were in this together, bound by the same fear, the same unspoken questions, and that connection felt powerful in the darkness. "Hey," I said, reaching out to place a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. "Whatever happens, we're going to face it together." She looked at me, her eyes dark and searching, and for a moment, something shifted between us, an unspoken understanding that went beyond words. The warmth of my hand on her shoulder seemed to linger, a steady anchor in the face of the unknown, and I could feel her lean into it, just slightly, as though drawing strength from the contact. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to talk to about this. I felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to keep her safe, even as I knew that there were no guarantees in this dark, ancient place. The swamp held secrets that went beyond anything we could comprehend. But in that moment, with Meredith beside me, the fear felt more manageable, tempered by the unspoken bond that had begun to grow between us. As the fire dwindled to embers, we fell into an easy silence, a quiet companionship that felt both natural and comforting. And despite the fear that loomed around us, I felt a strange sense of peace, a warmth that went beyond the physical, a connection that was deeper and more profound than anything I'd expected to find in this dark, unforgiving place. The following morning, we awoke to a heavy fog hanging over the swamp, thick and damp, reducing visibility to mere feet in every direction. The world felt enclosed, as though we were trapped in a bubble of mist and shadows, isolated from everything outside the swamp's dense, murky embrace. Jacobs was already awake, his expression hard and focused as he went over our supplies, his gaze scanning the perimeter with the intensity of someone who'd spent years in hostile territory. He shot me a look, a slight nod of acknowledgement, though I could see the tension in his jaw, the wariness in his eyes. He hadn't seen what we'd seen last night, but he knew. He knew that we were up against something that defied explanation, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the natural world. "We need to move," Jacob said, his voice low and steady. "That thing's out there, and it knows we're here. The longer we stay, the more dangerous this becomes." Meredith nodded, though I could see the fear in her eyes, the flicker of doubt that lingered in her gaze. She was trying to stay strong, to keep up the facade of confidence, but I could sense the worry beneath the surface, the gnawing fear that we were dealing with something far beyond our control. As we packed up camp, I caught her eye, offering a reassuring smile. She gave me a faint, grateful nod, and I could feel that same flicker of warmth, a shared understanding that made the fear feel less overwhelming, a connection that went beyond words. We set off, moving deeper into the swamp, each of us on high alert, our senses attuned to every sound, every movement. The fog clung to us like a shroud, dampening our footsteps, muffling the world around us, until it felt as though we were walking through a dream, a dark, twisted vision that seemed to shift and change with every step. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the faint drip of water from the trees above. Every sound seemed amplified, each rustle a potential threat, each shadow a possible danger. And then, without warning, it came. A sudden, deafening roar shattered the silence, echoing through the trees, sending a shockwave of fear through us. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural growl that resonated in my chest, filling the air with a primal fury that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. "Get down," Jacob shouted, pulling his rifle up, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I grabbed Meredith, pulling her down behind a fallen log, my heart pounding as I listened to the creature's roar fade into the silence. The swamp felt different now, darker, more dangerous, the air thick with the scent of fear and anticipation. "Stay close," I whispered, keeping my arm around Meredith's shoulders, feeling the tension in her body, the way she pressed against me, seeking comfort in the face of the unknown. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and frightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What was that?" I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the log. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's close." The silence stretched out, each second an eternity, each heartbeat a reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of our vision. I could feel Meredith's breath against my neck, warm and fast, her hand clutching my arm, her fear a mirror of my own. And then it struck. A massive shape hurtled out of the fog, a blur of shadow and fury, its claws slashing through the air as it lunged at Jacobs, its roar a deafening, bone-chilling sound that sent a shockwave of terror through me. Jacobs fired, his shots ringing out in rapid succession, the bullets tearing through the fog, but the creature was too fast, too powerful, its massive form twisting and dodging with a terrifying grace. "Run," Jacobs shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Get out of here." I grabbed Meredith's hand, pulling her to her feet, my heart racing as we stumbled through the fog, our footsteps echoing in the silence as we fled, the creature's roar fading into the distance. We didn't stop until we were far from the clearing, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our bodies tense with fear and adrenaline. We collapsed against a tree, our hearts pounding, our minds reeling from the encounter. Meredith looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. We left him." I shook my head, my hand squeezing hers, offering what little comfort I could. "Jacobs knew the risks. He told us to run." She nodded, though I could see the guilt in her eyes, the lingering regret that clung to her like a shadow. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, a fragile reminder of life in the face of death. The swamp closed in around us, the mist so thick that every breath felt like inhaling water. My pulse was racing, the echoes of that monstrous roar still rattling in my chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but I kept my grip firm on Meredith's hand, grounding both of us in the panic-filled haze. I could feel her fingers trembling against mine, yet she squeezed back, a small but reassuring reminder that we were in this together. Jacobs had stayed back, his figure swallowed up by the fog. His last words, "Run," still rang in my ears. He'd held his ground, risking everything to give us a chance. But that chance felt fragile, almost illusionary, as we moved blindly through the swamp, each step a battle against the slick, uneven ground, and the ever-watchful silence that followed the roar. "Don't look back," I whispered to Meredith, hearing the strain in my own voice. "Just keep moving." She nodded, her breaths coming in short gasps as she kept pace beside me, her hand clutching mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. I could feel the weight of her fear, the uncertainty and terror that had wrapped around us since we'd set foot in this cursed place. But underneath it all was a determination, a spark of resilience that had kept her pushing forward even as the swamp closed in around us, a testament to her strength. A few hundred yards further, the fog began to thin, the shadows retreating as a pale, sickly light filtered through the trees. I slowed, glancing around to get my bearings, listening for any sound that might signal the creature's return. But the swamp was silent, an eerie, unnatural quiet that felt as oppressive as the fog itself. "We should stop," I murmured, glancing at Meredith. "Catch our breath. See if it's still following." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as she leaned against a tree, her face pale, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and I could see the toll the encounter had taken on her, the shock and exhaustion that etched deep lines across her face. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft, trying to mask the worry that crept into my words. She gave a shaky nod, though I could see the way her hands trembled, the tension that still gripped her. I didn't think it would be like this," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I knew it would be dangerous, but I didn't expect—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting into the distance, as though the words themselves were too terrible to voice. I reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that ran through her. "None of us did. But we're here now, and we'll get through this. Together." She looked up at me, her eyes dark and searching, and for a moment something shifted between us, an unspoken understanding that went beyond fear and survival. There was a softness in her gaze, a vulnerability that felt raw and real, a reminder of the humanity that bound us, even in this unforgiving place. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible, a faint smile ghosting across her lips, "for staying with me, for everything." The connection between us felt almost palpable, a fragile thread that held us together even as the darkness closed in. I gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, feeling a surge of protectiveness that surprised even me, a fierce determination to keep her safe, no matter what lay ahead. Before I could respond, a rustling sound echoed from somewhere behind us, a faint but unmistakable disturbance that sent a shiver down my spine. Instantly, Meredith's eyes widened, her hand tightening around mine, her fear mirrored in my own gaze. "Stay quiet," I whispered, pulling her close as we crouched low, our bodies pressed against the thick roots of a nearby tree, hidden beneath the dense, hanging moss that draped over us like a veil. The rustling grew louder, a steady, deliberate movement that echoed through the swamp, each step a reminder that we were not alone. I held my breath, my grip on Meredith's hand firm, my other hand reaching instinctively for my weapon, though I knew that a few rounds wouldn't stop whatever had left those massive tracks. The silence stretched out, each second a tension-filled eternity, every heartbeat a reminder of the creature's proximity. Meredith's breath was warm against my shoulder, her body tense beside me, her gaze fixed on the shadows that stretched out beyond the tree, her fear a mirror of my own. Then the rustling stopped. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness that felt almost tangible, a suffocating presence that pressed down on us, as though the very swamp itself was holding its breath. I felt the weight of it, the oppressive, watchful gaze of the creature as it lingered just beyond our sight, hidden in the shadows, waiting. My hand found Meredith's, squeezing gently, a silent reassurance that we were in this together, that no matter what happened, I would be there to protect her. She squeezed back, her fingers trembling slightly, but I could feel the determination in her grip, the silent resolve that matched my own. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence faded, the oppressive weight lifting as the swamp released its breath, the shadows retreating, leaving only silence in its wake. Slowly, cautiously, I straightened, scanning the area for any sign of the creature. The swamp was still, the fog swirling lazily around us, as though oblivious to the terror that had passed through moments before. "It's gone," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath, though I kept my hand on Meredith's shoulder, unwilling to break the contact. She nodded, exhaling a shaky breath, her hand still gripping mine. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the gratitude there, the unspoken thanks that needed no words. In that moment, the connection between us felt more profound than anything I'd ever experienced. A bond forged in fear and trust. A fragile yet unbreakable thread that held us together in the face of the unknown. But the silence didn't last long. Just as we began to relax, another sound broke through the quiet. A faint rhythmic drumming that echoed through the swamp, growing louder with each passing second. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, each step sending a ripple of fear through me. "It's coming back," Meredith whispered, her voice tight with fear. I tightened my grip on her hand, pulling her close as we ducked low, our bodies pressed against the thick, knotted roots that stretched out beneath the tree. The footsteps grew louder, each one a heavy, deliberate thud that seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending shivers of dread up my spine. The creature was close now, its massive form hidden just beyond the veil of fog, its presence a looming threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to flee. But I held my ground, my grip on Meredith's hand a silent reminder that we were in this together, that no matter what happened, we would face it as one. And then, just when the footsteps were at their loudest, they stopped. Silence fell over the swamp once more, a tense, watchful quiet that felt almost suffocating, the air thick with the creature's presence, its gaze a tangible weight that pressed down on us. We stayed like that, frozen in place, our breaths shallow and quiet, our bodies tense with fear, waiting for the creature to make its move. But it didn't. It just stood there, hidden in the fog, watching us, its presence a silent threat, a reminder that we were no longer in control, that we were at the mercy of something far more powerful, far more ancient. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began to recede, the heavy, deliberate thuds growing fainter and fainter until they were nothing more than a distant echo, fading into the mist. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding, my body sagging with relief as the creature's presence faded, leaving us alone once more in the silent, shadowed swamp. "We need to keep moving," I whispered, though I made no move to pull away from Meredith, the warmth of her body a grounding comfort in the darkness. She nodded, her gaze lingering on me, her eyes soft with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that sent a faint warmth flickering through me, a reminder of the connection we'd shared in that moment, a bond that went beyond words. For a brief moment we just stood there, our gazes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between us. And then slowly, reluctantly, we broke apart, the urgency of our situation pulling us back to the present, the reality of our mission, a stark reminder of the danger that still loomed. But as we set off once more, moving deeper into the swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, that the bond we'd formed in that moment was more than just survival, more than just fear. It was a connection, a fragile yet powerful thread that held us together, a reminder that in the face of the unknown, we were not alone. The path ahead was a twisted, tangled maze of roots and shadows, each step a battle against the swamp's relentless hold, the fog clinging to us like a shroud. The silence was oppressive, an ever-present reminder of the creature that lurked just beyond the edge of our vision, a threat that loomed over us like a dark, silent predator. But even as the fear pressed down on me, I felt a strange sense of calm, a resilience that came from the knowledge that I was not alone. Meredith's presence beside me was a steady anchor, a reminder of the bond we'd shared in that moment of fear, a connection that went beyond words, beyond logic. We moved in silence, each step a cautious advance into the unknown, our eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The swamp felt alive, a dark, pulsing entity that watched our every move, its secrets hidden beneath layers of moss and mud waiting to be uncovered. And as we ventured deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led, guided toward something that lay at the heart of the swamp, something ancient and powerful, something that held the answers we sought. But as the shadows closed in around us, I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that those answers might come at a price we might not be ready to pay. The fog thickened as we pressed forward, swallowing us in an eerie, almost liquid quiet. The air was stagnant, clinging to us in damp waves that seemed to muffle every sound, every breath, as if the swamp itself had drawn a veil over the world. The only constant was the soft crunch of our footsteps on the muddy ground, each step careful and calculated, our senses stretched to the breaking point. The silence around us felt unnatural, weighted with something unseen, something ancient and powerful. My skin prickled with the awareness that the swamp was not just a setting but a presence, something alive and watchful, something that bore secrets we couldn't even begin to comprehend. The ground beneath us was soft and shifting, the kind of earth that could swallow you whole if you made the wrong move. Meredith walked close beside me, her steps mirroring mine, her face drawn with tension and determination. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that pulsed in my own veins, but there was something else too, an unyielding strength that had carried her this far, a quiet resilience that I couldn't help but admire. We'd barely spoken since our encounter with the creature, each of us too absorbed in our own thoughts, the enormity of what we'd seen weighing heavily on us. But now, with the swamp pressing in tighter, the silence between us felt almost unbearable, a reminder of the isolation, the crushing realization that we were alone in a place that seemed intent on consuming us. I glanced at Meredith, catching her gaze as she looked up at me, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something that called out to me in a way I couldn't ignore. And in that moment, the swamp faded. The fear subsided, leaving only the two of us, bound together in the face of the unknown. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, my voice barely a whisper, my hand reaching out instinctively to brush a strand of hair from her face. She managed a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed the depth of her fear. "As okay as I can be, given everything," she murmured, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting mine again. "I've faced danger before, but this feels different. Like it's personal." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. This wasn't just a hunt. It was something far more sinister, something that felt almost predestined, as though the swamp had chosen us, lured us into its depths with promises of secrets and hidden truths, only to trap us in a web of fear and darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Meredith was more than just a teammate. In the dark, oppressive silence of the swamp, she was a lifeline, a grounding presence that reminded me of what was real, what was worth fighting for. And as our gazes held, I felt something shift between us, a subtle, unspoken connection that went beyond words, beyond the mission. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice low but filled with conviction. "I won't let anything happen to you." She looked at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hint of something that was almost a smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand finding mine, her fingers warm and steady, a small but powerful gesture that sent a surge of warmth through me, a reminder that in this dark, unforgiving place, we still had each other. Before either of us could say more, a sudden rustling shattered the quiet, snapping us back to the harsh reality of our surroundings. We both froze, our gazes darting to the shadows that loomed just beyond the edge of the path. watching as the branches swayed, the leaves rustling in a strange, rhythmic pattern that seemed almost deliberate. My hand tightened around hers, a silent promise, a reassurance. As we crouched low, our bodies pressed close together, hidden beneath the thick, hanging moss that draped over the branches like a shroud. The rustling grew louder, more pronounced, each sound a reminder of the creature that stalked us, the ancient predator that watched us from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I could feel Meredith's breath against my neck, her body tense beside me, her fingers gripping mine with a desperation that matched my own. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rustling stopped. The swamp fell silent once more, the oppressive quiet settling over us like a suffocating weight, a reminder that we were not alone. I released a slow, steady breath, my heart pounding as I listened for any sign of movement, any hint that the creature was still watching. But the silence was absolute, an eerie, unnatural stillness that seemed to press down on us, amplifying every sound, every heartbeat. Meredith looked at me, her eyes wide, her face pale but determined. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I glanced around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, my mind racing as I considered our options. We couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for the creature to make its move. But every instinct screamed that it was watching, that it was out there, waiting for us to step into its trap. "We keep moving," I said finally, my voice low but firm. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. We have to keep going." She nodded, her gaze steady, her hand still gripping mine, a small but powerful reminder of the bond that held us together in the face of the unknown. And as we rose, our steps slow and cautious, I felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to protect her, to keep us both safe, no matter what lay ahead. The path ahead twisted and turned, each bend a new layer of darkness, a deeper descent into the heart of the swamp. The trees grew closer, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense, shadowed canopy, filtering out what little light remained, casting us into a perpetual twilight that felt both timeless and oppressive. As we moved, Meredith's hand slipped into mine, a steady anchor in the shifting shadows, a reminder of the connection that had grown between us, fragile yet unbreakable. Her presence was a comfort, a steady warmth that grounded me, even as the swamp's secrets loomed ever closer, waiting to be uncovered. Every so often, she would glance up at me, her gaze soft yet intense, a silent question in her eyes, a flicker of something that went beyond fear, beyond survival. And in those moments, the swamp seemed to fade, the darkness retreating, leaving only the two of us, bound together in a way that felt both natural and inevitable. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured, her voice barely audible, her gaze holding mine. "I don't think I could do this alone." I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, feeling a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to keep her safe. "You don't have to. We're in this together." She nodded, a faint smile ghosting across her lips, a flicker of warmth that cut through the fear, a reminder that even in this dark, unforgiving place, there was still light, still hope. But the peace was short-lived. As we rounded a bend, a sudden, chilling sound echoed through the swamp, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine, a sound that resonated with a primal fury, a warning that we were not alone. We froze, our gazes locked, the unspoken fear reflected in her eyes, the knowledge that the creature was close, that it was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear, her hand clinging to mine. I scanned the shadows, my mind racing as I considered our options. We couldn't outrun it, not in this terrain, not with the swamp closing in around us. But we could try to outsmart it, to find a place to hide, to wait it out until it moved on. "There," I murmured, nodding toward a dense thicket of vines and undergrowth, a small, shadowed alcove that offered a semblance of cover. "We can hide there. It might give us a chance to wait it out." She nodded, her face pale but resolute, her hand still gripping mine as we moved toward the thicket, our steps careful and silent, each movement a reminder of the danger that loomed just beyond the edge of our vision. As we settled into the shadows, the vines draping over us like a protective curtain, I felt her lean against me, her body warm and steady beside mine, a grounding presence in the darkness. Her hand found mine, her fingers entwining with mine, a silent promise, a reassurance that we were in this together. The creature's growls grew louder, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground, sending a shockwave of fear through me. But I held my ground, my hand steady on Meredith's, a reminder that no matter what happened, we would face it as one. The minutes stretched into eternity, each second a tense, breathless silence as we waited, listening for any sign of movement, any hint that the creature was drawing nearer. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing down on us with an intensity that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet strength that came from the knowledge that I was not alone. Meredith's presence was a comfort, a steady warmth that reminded me of what was real, what was worth fighting for. Finally, the growls faded, the creature's presence receding into the distance, leaving only silence in its wake. We stayed in the thicket for a few moments longer, neither of us willing to break the stillness, the fragile peace that had settled over us. When I finally looked at her, I could see the relief in her eyes, the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips, a reminder of the connection we'd shared in that moment of fear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, her hand still in mine, a silent promise that went beyond words. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, my own smile tugging at the corners of my lips, a warmth spreading through me that was stronger than the fear, stronger than the darkness. And as we rose, moving forward together, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it as one. We had barely moved 100 yards before the atmosphere around us shifted, the air thickening, the shadows deepening in a way that felt almost unnatural. The swamp was already a place of darkness and secrets, but this was different. It was as if the land itself had grown aware of our intentions, tightening its grip on us, daring us to take another step closer to whatever lay hidden in its depths. Meredith walked beside me, her gaze darting nervously around, her shoulders tense with the weight of the silence that pressed down on us. I could feel her apprehension, a tension that mirrored my own, and as we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing some invisible line, stepping into territory that we had no right to enter. "Something feels wrong," Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand brushing against mine as though seeking reassurance. I nodded, glancing around, my senses sharp, every instinct alert to the slightest sound, the faintest movement. "Stay close," I murmured, my hand finding hers, a silent promise that no matter what lay ahead, I would be there, right beside her. The ground beneath us grew softer, the mud pulling at our boots, each step a struggle as we fought against the swamp's relentless grip. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us like skeletal fingers, as if the swamp itself were reaching for us, eager to pull us into its depths. We moved slowly, cautiously, our breaths shallow as we pressed forward, the silence around us so thick that even the smallest sound felt like an intrusion. Every so often, I would glance at Meredith, catching the faint flicker of fear in her eyes, the same fear that gnawed at my own resolve. But there was something else there too, a determination that matched my own, a resilience that reminded me of the bond we'd forged in the face of the unknown. We were getting closer. I could feel it. The signs were all around us, the claw marks on the trees, the strange, half-buried bones scattered along the path, the faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay that hung in the air. The creature was near, watching us, waiting. Suddenly, Meredith stopped, her hand tightening around mine, her gaze fixed on something just ahead. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. I followed her gaze, squinting through the fog as I tried to make out what she was seeing. At first it was just a shadow, a dark shape half hidden among the trees. But as I focused, the shape began to take form, a mound of earth, half overgrown with moss and vines, its surface littered with bones and fragments of metal, pieces of torn fabric that fluttered in the faint breeze like ghostly reminders of those who had come before us. A chill ran down my spine as I took in the scene, the realization sinking in with a cold, sickening clarity. "It's a trap," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath, my hand instinctively pulling Meredith back. This whole area, it's a feeding ground." Meredith's face went pale, her eyes wide with horror, as she took in the scene, the scattered remnants of what was left of the creature's prey, a silent testament to the brutality that lay hidden beneath the swamp's surface. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that gnawed at my own resolve, a reminder that we were not just dealing with an animal. This was a predator, a creature that hunted with intelligence and intent, one that had lured us into its territory with the precision of a seasoned killer. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice tight with panic, her hand gripping mine as though it were a lifeline. I nodded, my gaze scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, my mind racing as I considered our options. We were deep in the creature's territory now, isolated and vulnerable, and the path we'd taken to get here felt like a distant memory, swallowed up by the swamp's ever-shifting landscape. "We'll backtrack," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that tightened my chest. "We'll move quickly and quietly. Don't look back." But as we turned to leave, a faint sound echoed through the swamp, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to resonate through the ground, vibrating up through my boots, a reminder of the creature's presence, its proximity. It was a sound that sent a shiver of dread through me, a reminder that we were no longer alone. "Go," I whispered, pulling Meredith close as we began to move, our steps quick but cautious, our breaths shallow as we navigated the twisting path that led back through the swamp. But the swamp had other plans. "We're close," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure her or myself. "We just have to keep moving." But even as I spoke, I could feel the doubt creeping in, the gnawing fear that we were being led, guided by an unseen hand that knew every inch of the swamp, every twist and turn of the path that had brought us here. And then, without warning, the ground beneath us gave way. We tumbled forward, our feet slipping on the slick, wet mud, our bodies crashing down into the darkness below, swallowed up by the swamp's relentless grip. I felt the cold, damp earth press against me, the weight of it suffocating, the darkness swallowing me whole as I struggled to find my bearings. "Meredith," I called, my voice muffled by the thick, damp air, my hands groping through the darkness as I searched for her, my heart pounding with a desperate fear. "I'm here." Her voice was faint, a distant whisper that seemed to echo through the darkness, a reminder that she was close, that she was safe. But as I reached out, my hand found only empty air, a chilling reminder of the isolation that pressed down on us, the darkness that separated us. "Hold on," I whispered, my voice a steady anchor in the darkness, a reminder of the bond that held us together, even in the face of the unknown. But the swamp was relentless, its grip tightening as we struggled to find each other, our bodies trapped in the darkness, our breaths shallow as we fought against the weight of the mud, the crushing force of the swamp that seemed determined to pull us under. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted, the ground solidifying beneath us, leaving us gasping for breath, our bodies caked in mud, our faces streaked with the remnants of the swamp's relentless grip. Meredith looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion, a reminder of the danger that loomed around us, the darkness that pressed in on all sides. "We're in its lair," she whispered, her voice trembling, a reminder of the trap we'd stumbled into, the prison that held us captive in the heart of the swamp. I nodded, my hand finding hers, a silent promise that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together, bound by a bond that went beyond fear, beyond survival. But even as I held her close, I couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp had more secrets, more horrors hidden beneath its surface, waiting to be uncovered. And as the shadows closed in around us, I knew that our journey was far from over. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seeped through my skin, leaving a lingering sensation of dread. The path that lay before us was no longer familiar. The twists and turns we'd taken seemed to shift in memory, like a mirage retreating as we drew closer. The shadows around us grew darker, deeper, casting an oppressive blanket of silence over the swamp. "Do you feel that?" Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, a chill running down my spine as I took in the twisted landscape, the dark, looming shapes that seemed to sway and shift in the shadows. It was as though the swamp had transformed, its usual stillness replaced by a pulsing, living darkness that watched our every move. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice a steady anchor in the darkness. "We're not safe here." Meredith nodded, her gaze steady, though I could see the fear that lingered in her eyes, a reminder of the danger that loomed around us. We were trapped, isolated in the heart of the swamp, surrounded by a darkness that seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating with every step we took. The path grew narrower, the trees pressing in closer, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out toward us like skeletal fingers, as though the swamp itself was reaching for us, eager to pull us into its depths. "We're almost there," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure her or myself. But even as I spoke, I could feel the weight of the swamp pressing down on us, a suffocating presence that wrapped around us like a shroud, a reminder that we were no longer in control. And as the shadows closed in, I knew that our journey was far from over. The silence hung thick around us, heavier than the fog, an oppressive blanket of tension that pressed down with an almost suffocating weight. Every breath felt shallow, as though the air itself had turned against us, and I could sense Meredith's fear, the way it radiated off her in palpable waves. But there was no sound, no movement, just the darkness, the heavy, watchful silence that seemed to close in tighter with each second that passed. We were trapped. The path that had once seemed so clear was now a twisted, tangled maze, the trees closing in around us, their gnarled branches forming a canopy so dense that it blocked out what little light remained. The swamp was no longer just a setting. It was a living, breathing thing, an entity that held us in its grip, watching and waiting, biding its time. Meredith glanced at me, her eyes wide, a question lingering in her gaze, though neither of us dared to speak. I could feel the tension in her body, the way she clung to my hand with a desperation that matched my own, a silent plea for reassurance that felt almost fragile in the face of the unknown. And then, the silence shattered. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, low and guttural, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to rise up from the very earth itself, vibrating through the ground, shaking the trees, filling the air with a primal fury that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a sound that spoke of ancient power, of hunger, of a creature that had ruled this swamp for longer than we could even imagine. Meredith's grip tightened around my hand, her body tense, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she fought to keep her fear in check. I could feel her heart racing, the pulse of it thrumming through her fingers, a reminder that we were still alive, still fighting, even in the face of the unknown. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath, my other hand reaching for my rifle. The cold steel a small comfort in the face of the darkness that surrounded us. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the shadows, her fear evident in the way she moved, each step careful and deliberate, as though one wrong move might draw the creature closer, might break the fragile peace that hung in the air. The growl grew louder, a steady, pulsing rhythm that filled the air, each sound a reminder of the creature's proximity, its hunger, its intent. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, And I knew that we were not alone, that the creature was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we moved, I kept my gaze fixed on the shadows, my senses sharp, every instinct alert to the slightest sound, the faintest movement. The ground beneath us was soft and yielding, each step sinking into the mud, the swamp's grip tightening as we pressed forward, as though it too were conspiring to keep us here, to trap us in its depths. And then, without warning, it appeared. At first it was just a shape, a dark, hulking shadow that loomed at the edge of our vision, half hidden among the trees, its form indistinct, almost dreamlike in the pale, shifting light. But as it moved closer, the details began to take shape. The massive, muscular body, the thick, matted fur that seemed to blend into the darkness, the long, sinewy limbs that moved with a fluid, almost unnatural grace. And then there were the eyes. They were dark, almost black, glimmering in the shadows with a cold, predatory intelligence, a gaze that was both calculating and hungry, as though it were studying us, measuring us, deciding whether we were worth the effort. I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct that screamed at me to run, to flee, to get as far away from this creature as possible. But I held my ground, my gaze fixed on the creature, my hand steady on my rifle, though I knew that a few bullets would do little against something of this size, this power. Meredith stood beside me, her body tense, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she watched the creature, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I could see the same realization dawning in her gaze, the knowledge that we were facing something far more dangerous than we had ever imagined, something that defied all logic and reason. It's watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling, a faint hint of wonder in her tone, as though the creature were something to be admired, even in the face of the danger it posed. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze away from the creature, the way it moved, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, as though it were part of the swamp itself, an extension of the darkness that surrounded us. And then it took a step forward. The ground trembled beneath us, the weight of its presence a physical force that pressed down on us, a reminder of the power it held, the dominance it commanded in this ancient, forgotten place. I could feel the fear rising in my chest, the instinct to run, to flee. But I held my ground, my gaze fixed on the creature, my mind racing as I searched for a way out, a plan, anything that might give us a chance. But before I could act, the creature lunged. It was a blur of shadow and motion, a massive shape hurtling toward us with a speed and grace that defied its size, its claws extended, its jaws open in a silent snarl. I barely had time to react, my body moving on instinct as I pulled Meredith to the side, her body colliding with mine as we tumbled into the mud, the creature's massive form crashing down where we had stood moments before. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, the force of it knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping for breath as I struggled to regain my bearings, to make sense of the chaos that surrounded us. Meredith was beside me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, though she was unhurt, a small miracle in the midst of the creature's fury. "We have to move," I shouted, grabbing her hand, my voice hoarse with urgency as I pulled her to her feet, our bodies slick with mud, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as we stumbled away from the creature, our steps quick but cautious, each one a battle against the swamp's relentless grip. The creature was close, too close. Its presence a tangible weight that pressed down on us, a reminder of the danger that loomed with every step we took. I could hear its growls, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to resonate through the ground, each one a reminder of its proximity, its intent. And then it lunged again. This time I was ready. I turned, raising my rifle, my finger on the trigger as I aimed at the creature, my gaze steady, my breath calm, even in the face of its massive form hurtling toward us. I fired, the sound of the shots echoing through the swamp, A brief, violent burst of light in the darkness. The bullet struck the creature, tearing through its fur, its flesh. A small, temporary victory in the face of the creature's relentless advance. It snarled, a deep, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. A reminder that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something that would not be deterred by a few bullets. But even as the creature reeled back, its movement slowed. I knew that we had only bought ourselves a few precious moments, a small window of opportunity that we could not afford to waste. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Meredith's hand, my voice a desperate plea as we turned and fled, our steps quick and unsteady, the ground shifting beneath us as we moved, the swamp's grip tightening with every step we took. The creature was close behind us, its growls a constant reminder of its presence, its intent. I could feel its breath on my neck, a hot, rancid gust of air that sent a surge of fear through me, a reminder of the danger that loomed with every step we took. But we couldn't stop, couldn't afford to slow down, even as the swamp grew darker, the shadows deeper. The path ahead a twisted, tangled mess of roots and mud that threatened to trip us, to pull us down into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the creature stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed down on us, a reminder of the danger that still loomed, hidden in the shadows, watching, waiting. We stopped, our breaths coming in short, ragged gasps, our bodies tense, our minds racing as we tried to make sense of the chaos, the violence that had passed, the danger that still lingered, unseen but ever present. Meredith looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and relief, a reminder of the bond that had held us together, the connection that had carried us through the darkness, the danger. And as we stood there, surrounded by the silence, the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching, that it was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The silence settled over us, thick and suffocating, pressing down like the weight of the swamp itself. My mind raced, heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what we had just seen, what we had just survived. The creature was no longer a rumor, no longer just a legend hidden in blurry photos and half-told stories. It was real, flesh and blood, primal and deadly. Meredith was leaning against a twisted tree root, her breath shallow and quick, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. Mud and sweat caked her face, her clothes torn and smeared from our frantic escape, yet there was a defiant glint in her gaze, a spark of resilience that reminded me of the strength that had carried us this far. As I steadied myself, my mind drifted back to that first briefing, the moment when this mission was just an idea, a curious case file with strange photos and eyewitness reports. Sitting in the dim motel room, we'd sifted through images of the swamp, accounts of strange, inhuman creatures, blurred shapes that had seemed so absurd then. Jacobs had been skeptical, his blunt, disbelieving snort filling the room as he'd tossed the file aside. "Another Bigfoot sighting," he'd muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Some wild animal with mange or a trick of the light. People around here see what they want to see." Meredith, though, had been different. She'd leaned forward, her fingers tracing the grainy outlines in the photos, her gaze intense, thoughtful. There was something in her expression, a mixture of fascination and curiosity that I couldn't quite understand. For her, the possibility that these sightings were real seemed to spark a strange kind of excitement, a sense that we were on the brink of discovering something beyond the ordinary. "We shouldn't dismiss this so easily," she had said, her voice firm but quiet. "People have been reporting strange sightings here for centuries. Legends of creatures that roam the Okefenokee, stories passed down through generations. And there are always similarities." Jacobs had laughed, his skepticism clear. "Come on, Doc. You're telling me you believe in monsters?" Meredith's gaze had been steady, unyielding. "Not monsters exactly, but perhaps something that science has yet to explain. An undiscovered species, maybe. An ancient predator adapted to its environment, one that doesn't follow the same rules we do. At the time, I had been silent, watching the exchange with a mix of amusement and curiosity. The idea of hunting a cryptid, a creature shrouded in myth, hiding in the dark recesses of the swamp, had seemed almost laughable. But now, standing in the very heart of the Okefenokee, the reality of it loomed larger than anything I could have imagined. The creature we had seen was not just an animal. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something that had lived here long before us, something that had claimed this swamp as its own. And now, as we struggled to catch our breath, the weight of that realization settled over us like a cold, unyielding shroud. "We saw it," Meredith whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze distant, lost in the shadows. "We actually saw it." I nodded, the enormity of it sinking in, a sense of disbelief mingling with the horror that lingered from our encounter. "It's real," I murmured, my voice hollow, as though saying it aloud might somehow make it more bearable. "It's been here all this time, hidden in the shadows, watching us." Meredith looked up at me, her eyes dark, haunted. "Do you remember what I said? About it being an undiscovered species?" I nodded, the memory of her words echoing in my mind, a faint reminder of the curiosity and excitement that had once filled her voice, now replaced by a cold, hard understanding of the danger we faced. "It's more than that," she whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on the shadows that loomed around us, the twisted, gnarled branches that seemed to reach out toward us, a reminder of the creature's presence. It's something else. It's as if the swamp itself gave birth to it, a predator designed to survive here, to protect this place. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of dread that went beyond fear, a primal instinct that warned me we were facing something far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The creature was not just an inhabitant of the swamp. It was a part of it, an extension of the darkness that surrounded us, a force that had existed long before us and would continue to exist long after we were gone. "We need to keep moving," I said finally, my voice steady but strained, my hand finding hers, a silent promise that we would face this together, no matter what lay ahead. She nodded, her fingers entwining with mine, a small but powerful gesture that sent a surge of warmth through me, a reminder that we were not alone, that we still had each other. But as we turned to leave, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the swamp, a reminder that the creature was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. I felt Meredith's hand tighten around mine, her body tense, her breath shallow as she listened, her gaze fixed on the darkness, a faint glimmer of fear lingering in her eyes. "What do we do if it attacks again?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze darting toward me, searching for reassurance. I met her gaze, my own fear mirrored in her eyes, though I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "We keep moving. We can't outrun it, but if we keep moving, we might be able to outmaneuver it." She nodded, though I could see the doubt that lingered in her gaze, the fear that gnawed at her resolve, a reminder of the danger that loomed with every step we took. As we moved, the ground grew softer, the mud clinging to our boots with a relentless grip, each step a struggle against the swamp's hold. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us as though the swamp itself were reaching for us, eager to pull us into its depths. We moved in silence, our breaths shallow, our steps careful and deliberate, each one a reminder of the creature's proximity, its presence a tangible weight that pressed down on us, a reminder of the danger that surrounded us on all sides. And then, just as we thought we might have escaped, the growl returned, louder this time, closer. It was a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder of the creature's power, its intent, a reminder that we were not just prey, but intruders, trespassers, in a land that did not belong to us. I tightened my grip on Meredith's hand, pulling her close as we moved faster, our steps quick and cautious, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as we navigated the twisted path that led deeper into the swamp. The creature was close behind us, its growls a constant reminder of its presence, its intent. I could feel its breath on my neck, a hot, rancid gust of air that sent a surge of fear through me, a reminder of the danger that loomed with every step we took. We stumbled through the mud, our bodies slick with sweat and grime, our breaths ragged as we fought against the swamp's relentless grip, each step a reminder of the creature's proximity, its presence a constant looming threat that hung over us like a dark, oppressive shadow. The path twisted and turned, each bend a new layer of darkness, a deeper descent into the heart of the swamp. And with every step, the growls grew louder, closer, a reminder that the creature was not just following us, it was hunting us. I glanced at Meredith, catching the flicker of fear in her gaze, the same fear that gnawed at my own resolve, a reminder of the bond that held us together, the connection that had carried us through the darkness. And in that moment, as the creature's growls echoed through the swamp, I knew that we were facing something far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. Something that went beyond fear, beyond survival. We were facing the swamp itself. The growls echoed through the swamp, a relentless reminder of the creature's presence, its relentless pursuit. Every step felt like we were sinking further into a nightmare. The mud gripped our boots, the air thick with humidity and fear, clinging to our skin like a living thing. I could feel the creature's eyes on us, its cold, calculating gaze that seemed to strip us of any illusion of safety. We stumbled forward, our breaths ragged, our bodies battered by the swamp's relentless grip. The darkness had closed in around us, thick and suffocating, a reminder of the ancient power that lurked here, a force that had claimed this place as its own, a predator that had lived and hunted long before we'd dared to set foot in its territory. "Do you think we'll make it?" Meredith whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with fear but determined. I looked at her, feeling the weight of her question settle heavily on me. I wanted to tell her yes, to promise her that we would survive this, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Instead, I took her hand, squeezing it gently, a silent promise that we would face whatever came next together. The creature's growls grew louder, a low, resonant sound that filled the air, vibrating through the ground, a reminder that it was closing in, its presence a tangible weight that pressed down on us, surrounding us. "We have to make a stand," I said, my voice steady but strained, my gaze fixed on the shadows that loomed around us. "If we keep running, we'll only wear ourselves down. We have to face it." Meredith nodded, her gaze steady, though I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, the same fear that gnawed at my own resolve. But there was something else there too, a fierce determination, a quiet strength that reminded me of the bond we had forged, the connection that had carried us through the darkness. We found a small clearing, a patch of solid ground surrounded by thick, twisted roots that formed a natural barrier, a last stand against the creature that stalked us. I readied my rifle, my hand steady, my gaze fixed on the shadows that stretched out before us, waiting for any sign of movement. Meredith stood beside me, her body tense, her hand gripping a makeshift weapon, a thick branch she'd found, its end sharpened to a point, a weapon that felt both primitive and powerful, a reminder that we were fighting for our lives in the most primal sense. And then, the creature appeared. It was a hulking shadow, a massive shape that loomed at the edge of the clearing, its dark, matted fur blending into the shadows, its eyes glimmering with a cold, predatory intelligence. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step a reminder of the power it held, the dominance it commanded in this ancient, forgotten place. I raised my rifle, my breath steady, my gaze fixed on the creature, though I knew that a few bullets would do little against something of this size, this power. But I held my ground, refusing to back down, refusing to let fear drive us away from our only chance of survival. The creature lunged, a massive shape hurtling toward us with a speed that defied its size. Its claws extended, its jaws open in a silent snarl. I fired, the shots echoing through the swamp, a brief, violent burst of light in the darkness. The bullet struck the creature, tearing through its fur, its flesh, but it barely slowed, its momentum carrying it forward, a force of nature, a predator that could not be stopped. And then, as it drew closer, Meredith lunged forward, her body a blur of motion as she drove her makeshift spear into the creature's side, her gaze fierce, her movements fueled by a determination that took my breath away. The creature roared, a sound of pure rage, a fury that sent a shockwave through the air, a reminder of the power it held, the danger it posed. But Meredith held her ground, her grip steady, her gaze unwavering as she stood against the creature, a force of will that defied the fear that loomed around us. With one last surge of strength, I raised my rifle, aiming for the creature's head, my breath steady, my gaze focused. I fired, the shot ringing out, a final, desperate act, a last stand against the darkness that threatened to consume us. The bullet struck true, tearing through the creature's skull, a burst of light and sound that filled the air, a reminder of the fragility of life, the thin line that separated us from death. The creature staggered, its massive form swaying, its eyes glazed with a mixture of fury and pain, a reminder of the power it held, the life it had claimed. And then, with a final, ragged breath, it collapsed, its body falling to the ground, a dark, lifeless shape that seemed to blend into the shadows, a reminder of the danger that had haunted us, the ancient power that had claimed this place as its own. We stood there in the silence, our breaths ragged, our bodies battered, our minds reeling from the horror that had passed. The swamp was still, the darkness retreating, leaving only the two of us, bound together in the face of the unknown, a reminder of the bond that had carried us through the darkness, the connection that had given us the strength to survive. The journey back to base was a blur, a haze of exhaustion and disbelief as we stumbled through the swamp, guided only by instinct and the faint, lingering traces of civilization that seemed so far removed from the horrors we had faced. When we finally arrived, we were met with silence, a quiet, watchful silence that seemed to press down on us, a reminder of the weight of what we had experienced, the danger that still lingered in our minds. We were taken to a debriefing room, a small, windowless space filled with harsh, artificial light, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the swamp. The room felt cold, sterile, a reminder that we were back in the real world, far removed from the ancient, primal forces that had haunted us. A man in a crisp suit entered, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady as he took his seat across from us, his presence a reminder of the authority he held, the power he commanded. "Report," he said, his voice cold, detached, a reminder that he saw us not as people but as assets, tools to be used and discarded as necessary. I glanced at Meredith, catching the flicker of fear in her gaze, the same fear that gnawed at my own resolve. But there was something else there too, a fierce determination, a quiet strength that reminded me of the bond we had forged, the connection that had carried us through the darkness. "We encountered the creature," I said finally, my voice steady, though I could feel the weight of the words, the horror that lingered just beneath the surface. "It's real, and it's not just an animal." The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp, a faint hint of interest flickering in his eyes. "Not just an animal? It's something ancient," Meredith said, her voice trembling, her gaze distant, lost in the memories of the creature, the darkness that had surrounded us. "It's a part of the swamp, a predator that has survived here for centuries. It's not something that can be controlled." The man was silent, his gaze thoughtful, calculating, as though weighing the implications of our words, considering the danger that lurked in the shadows of the swamp. "And you killed it?" he asked finally, his tone flat, emotionless. I nodded, though the memory of the creature's final moments lingered, a reminder of the fragility of life, the thin line that separated us from death. "Yes, but it wasn't easy. It's unlike anything I've ever seen." The man gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable, though I could sense the satisfaction in his gaze, the faint glimmer of approval that came with a mission accomplished. "Very well," he said, rising to his feet, his gaze steady, a reminder of the authority he held, the power he commanded. "Your mission is complete. You're dismissed." And just like that, it was over. We left the room, our footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway, the weight of our experience pressing down on us, a reminder of the horror we had faced, the danger that still lingered in the shadows of the swamp. As we stepped outside, the world felt different, quieter, as though the darkness of the swamp had left a mark on us, a reminder of the ancient forces that lurked just beyond the edge of civilization. Meredith looked at me, her gaze soft, haunted, a reminder of the bond that had carried us through the darkness, the connection that had given us the strength to survive. "We'll never forget this, will we?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a faint hint of sorrow in her tone. I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on me, a reminder of the horror that still lingered in my mind. "No, we'll carry it with us, always." And as we walked away, leaving the base behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had left a part of ourselves in that swamp. A piece of our humanity swallowed up by the darkness, a reminder that we had survived something that defied all logic, all reason. And I knew that no matter where life took us, we would never truly leave that place behind. The swamp, the creature, the darkness, it was all a part of us now, a haunting reminder of the unknown, a force that lingered, waiting, watching. And as the world moved on, blissfully unaware of the horrors that lurked just beyond its reach, I knew that we would always remember. We had faced the darkness and survived. But we were not unscathed. We were changed, forever bound to the shadows that haunted us, a reminder that some secrets are better left hidden, some forces left undisturbed. And as we disappeared into the night, the memory of the swamp lingered, a dark, eternal presence that would never truly let us go.